The prairie wind of Dry Creek, Montana, had a language all its own. It was a dry, insistent whisper that carried the grit of the high plains and the scent of distant rain that never seemed to arrive. In the late summer of 1887, that wind was the town's most constant companion, worrying the loose shutters of the Silver Spur Saloon and sweeping plumes of fine red dust against the sturdy pine walls of the First Baptist Church that faced it across the wide, rutted street. The dust settled on everything, a fine crimson powder that clung to hat brims and eyelashes, a constant reminder that this land was hard, unforgiving, and not yet fully tamed. At the bottom of a gentle slope, where the main street surrendered to open country, stood the schoolhouse. It was a single room, built of the same honest pine as the church, with a stout fieldstone chimney and a proud brass bell mounted in a small belfry above the door. For Abigail Bell, who had traveled more than 2,000 miles from the green, orderly hills of Vermont, that bell was a promise. It was the sound of civilization, a clear, ringing note of progress against the vast, wild silence. At 24, Abigail was practical. Not poetic, though she saw a certain kind of beauty in a well-sharpened slate pencil and a clean blackboard. Her hands, though fine-boned, were seldom idle. She believed in the small, tangible justices of the world, a correctly spelled word, a neatly solved sum, the quiet wonder on a child's face when the letters on a page finally arranged themselves into a story. Her immediate goal was simple: to establish a stable classroom in this raw-boned town. Her deeper purpose, the one that had pulled her west, was to build a place of belonging, a sanctuary of dignity where a child's worth was measured by their curiosity, not by the dust on their father's boots. She stood on the schoolhouse steps, her hand on the thick rope, and took a deep breath. The air tasted of dust and sun-baked wood. Across the street, a handful of cowboys were already tying their horses to the hitching post outside the saloon, their morning ride finished. One of them stood apart from the others, leaning against the rail. He was tall, his frame lean but broad in the shoulders, dressed in worn denim and leather. He was Luke Callahan, a man who worked cattle for the sprawling Porter Ranch. Abigail knew of him mostly through the town's low murmurs. They said he was quiet, that he was the best rider in the county, and that a shadow from a past altercation, a matter of self-defense they called it, clung to him like the ever-present dust. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were measured and his manners possessed a quiet, almost startling courtesy. Watching them all from the porch of his general store was Ephraim Pike, the town's deputy mayor and the chairman of the school board. He was a man built of straight lines and rigid principles, his starched collar a fortress against the untidiness of the frontier. He owned the store, had a significant interest in the Dry Creek Bank, and was a close confidant of the equally unbending Pastor Abel Griggs. To Mr. Pike, the world was a ledger of right and wrong, and he was its self-appointed bookkeeper. He had made it clear to Abigail that the school was to serve the children of what he called the town's respectable families, a term whose definition seemed to shrink or expand to suit his own interests. Abigail put such thoughts aside. It was time. She pulled the rope. The brass bell sang out, a clean, hopeful peal that cut through the wind's whisper. It was a call to order, a summons to the future. And then chaos answered. From the top of the street, a freight wagon, its team of 2 heavy horses panicked and wide-eyed, came barreling down the slope. A sharp crack, like a rifle shot, echoed a moment before, a broken axle or perhaps a snapped brake line. The driver sawed uselessly at the reins, his shouts lost in the thunder of hooves and the rattle of heavy wheels on the hard-packed earth. The wagon careened from one side of the street to the other, a runaway engine of wood and iron. Directly in its path, near the schoolhouse steps, stood a little girl. It was Maya, the daughter of a Mexican family that worked a small, hard-scrabble plot of land south of town. She had been tracing a pattern in the dirt with a stick, her back to the impending disaster, a small, brightly colored shawl around her shoulders. She looked up, frozen by the terrifying noise, her dark eyes huge with fear. Time seemed to stretch and slow. Abigail's heart leapt into her throat. She cried out the girl's name, a useless gesture against the roaring momentum. The men outside the saloon scattered, pressing themselves against the building fronts. But Luke Callahan did not scatter. In a single, fluid motion, he pushed away from the rail and swung into his saddle. His horse, a powerful buckskin, responded instantly, trained to the slightest shift in its rider's weight. Luke spurred the animal into a dead run, not away from the danger, but directly toward it, angling to intercept the runaway team. The wind whipped his bandana across the lower half of his face, and his hat was pulled low, his focus absolute. He held the reins with a firm, disciplined grace, his body a part of the horse's powerful surge. He reached the wagon just as it swerved toward the schoolhouse. Instead of trying to stop the heavy wagon head-on, a fool's errand that would have killed both him and his horse, he rode alongside the panicked team. Leaning far out of his saddle, he grabbed the bridle of the lead horse, his voice a low, commanding sound that was somehow heard over the din. He was not fighting the team's momentum, but guiding it, turning their terror into a controlled, arcing turn. The heavy wagon groaned, its wheels screaming as they skidded sideways, missing Maya by mere inches. The little girl was thrown backward by the gust of wind and shock, landing in a heap in the soft dust. The wagon shuddered to a halt 20 feet past the school. Its sides scraped against the town's water trough, the horses trembling and blowing, their panic finally subsiding under Luke's steady hand. The entire event had taken less than 10 seconds. A cloud of red dust, churned up by the horses and wheels, began to settle, coating the sudden, ringing silence. Abigail was already moving, her own fear forgotten. She rushed to Maya, kneeling in the dirt and gathering the small, trembling girl into her arms. The child was crying, not from injury but from sheer fright. Abigail held her close, murmuring soothing words, her hand stroking the girl's dark hair. A crowd was gathering now, drawn by the commotion. Ephraim Pike bustled forward, his face a mask of stern disapproval. Men stepped out from the saloon, their morning drink interrupted. Luke Callahan dismounted, his movements unhurried as he calmed his own horse with a quiet word and a pat on the neck. He then walked over to the wagon team, checking them for injuries, his focus entirely on the animals. Abigail looked up from the child in her arms. "Gracias a Dios, estás bien," she whispered to Maya, the Spanish phrases coming to her naturally, a tool for comfort. "Estás a salvo. You are safe." The girl's sobs quieted to whimpers. Abigail looked across the dusty space at Luke, who had just finished his inspection of the horses. Their eyes met for a brief, charged moment. His were a steady, clear gray, and in their depths, she saw a flicker of something she could not name, a deep-seated weariness mixed with a quiet strength. It was a look that seemed to see right through the surface of things. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks and quickly looked away, feeling suddenly flustered and exposed. "Is the child all right?" Luke's voice was low and calm, with a rough edge like worn leather. "She is just frightened," Abigail replied, helping Maya to her feet. She stood and faced him, brushing the dust from her skirt. I have never seen anything like it. You saved her life, Mr. Callahan." She spoke clearly, her voice carrying to the assembled townspeople. "We are all in your debt." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd, but Ephraim Pike stepped forward, his expression sour. "Ahem. While the outcome is fortunate, I must say this is a most unseemly incident. A cowboy causing such a commotion directly in front of the schoolhouse. It sets a poor example for the children." Abigail stared at him, incredulous. A poor example, he prevented a tragedy. Pike's gaze flickered to Maya, who was now hiding behind Abigail's skirts, and his lips thinned. He had clearly heard Abigail's Spanish, and it did not please him. Be that as it may, This is a place of learning, not a rodeo arena." He cleared his throat and addressed the crowd. "Let us all return to our business. The situation is handled." He turned and walked back toward his store, his stiff posture radiating disapproval. The crowd began to disperse, talking in low tones. Abigail was left standing in the settling dust with the little girl and the quiet cowboy. The smell of horse sweat, pine, and fear hung in the air. Luke tipped his hat to her, a small, formal gesture. "Ma'am." "Wait," she said. "I mean it. Thank you." She glanced up at the schoolhouse, at the bell still hanging silently in its belfry. A small, wry smile touched her lips. "I believe I owe you a bell that is still hanging." A ghost of a smile touched his own mouth, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "You had best keep it," he said, his voice dry. "Just in case I decide to ride straight through your classroom next time." He turned then and walked back to his horse, swinging into the saddle with the same easy grace he had shown moments before. He gathered his reins, gave her one last, unreadable look, and rode off down the street, leaving Abigail with a racing heart and a profound sense of the deep, unspoken currents that ran beneath the dusty surface of Dry Creek. Later that day, after the children had been dismissed, Ephraim Pike paid a visit to the schoolhouse. He did not mention the morning's events directly, but his meaning was clear. He spoke of maintaining a certain standard, of the importance of an orderly environment. He reminded her that the school board's generosity was contingent on her teaching a curriculum that reflected the town's proper values. "We expect you to focus on the children from our founding families," Pike stated, his eyes scanning the simple classroom. "We cannot be expected to provide an education for every stray that wanders into this valley. It is a matter of resource allocation. You understand." Abigail stood very straight behind her desk, the chalk dust on her fingers feeling like a kind of armor. She thought of Maya's terrified face, and of the quiet courage of the man who had saved her. She thought of her father, a printer who had believed that knowledge was a right, not a privilege, and that a single printed page could be a lever to move the world. "Mr. Pike," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Every child who comes through that door is a student in this school. Their name, their language, or the work their parents do does not change that. I will not turn any child away." Ephraim Pike's eyes narrowed. He saw not a compliant schoolteacher from the east, but a woman with a will as strong as his own. He gave a curt, dismissive nod. "We shall see about that. Miss Bell, we shall see." He left, and Abigail was alone in the quiet room. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dancing motes of dust in the air. She looked at the empty benches and the silent blackboard. She had made her choice. She had drawn a line in the red Montana dust, and she knew, with a certainty that was both frightening and exhilarating, that the real challenges in Dry Creek were only just beginning. Life in Dry Creek was governed by a rhythm as steady as a slow heartbeat. It began with the clink of milk pails in the pre-dawn chill, followed by the first confident ring of the church bell calling the faithful to acknowledge the new day. Saturdays brought the farmers' market, a weekly explosion of chatter and commerce where a man could trade a well-cured ham for a bolt of cloth or a sturdy new axe handle. As the sun dipped low, painting the vast sky in shades of orange and violet, the rhythm would shift. The swinging doors of the Silver Spur Saloon would begin their percussive beat, spilling yellow light and the boisterous sounds of men shedding the day's burdens onto the dusty street. Abigail Bell found her own quiet counterpoint to this rhythm in the boarding house of Mrs. Alma Quinn. Alma was a widow in her late 50s, with a face mapped by laughter and hard times in equal measure, and a tongue as sharp and straight as a skinning knife. She had buried a husband, raised 3 sons, and possessed a brand of wisdom that could not be found in any book Abigail owned. Her home was a small, tidy refuge of warm bread, clean linens, and unapologetic honesty. "That Ephraim Pike looks at the world like he's trying to figure out how much it owes him," Alma declared one evening. watching Abigail grade papers by the light of a kerosene lamp, and the Pastor Griggs is right there beside him, ready to write up the bill in the name of the Lord. Abigail smiled, dipping her quill pen into the ink pot. They are men of conviction. Alma, so is a mule when it decides not to cross a creek, Alma retorted, her knitting needles clicking a rapid, steady beat. Conviction without common sense is just a fancy name for stubbornness. You watch yourself around them. Girl, they don't like things they can't put in a box and label. Abigail carried that thought with Ta into her schoolhouse each morning. The single room was her dominion, a world smelling of chalk dust, wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove, and the faint, sweet scent of the apple she kept on her desk. Her students were a chaotic, wonderful assortment of ages and abilities. She had 6-year-olds struggling to form their letters and 15-year-old farm boys whose hands were more accustomed to a shovel than a book, but who possessed a deep, unspoken hunger for the world that lay beyond the pages of an almanac. Among them was Daniel Pike, Ephraim's son. He was a boy with his father's sharp intelligence, but none of his rigid certainty. A spark of mischief danced in his eyes, and he was the first to master a new concept and the first to use it to orchestrate a small, harmless prank, like hiding the chalk or teaching the younger children to spell words backwards. Then there was Maya, the little girl Luke Callahan had rescued. She was timid, her English still hesitant, a small, quiet shadow in the corner of the room, but her eyes followed Abigail with a fierce, trusting devotion, and her slate was always the neatest, her letters drawn with painstaking care. Abigail refused to teach by rote memorization alone. She broke the children into small groups based on their reading level, a novel concept in a one-room school. She had the older students read aloud to the younger ones, their deep, sometimes clumsy voices filling the room with tales of faraway lands. She invented songs to help them learn their multiplication tables, the sound of their combined voices a joyful noise that often drifted out the open windows. She had even tacked a large, hand-drawn map of the United States to one wall, a work of her own creation, and would spend hours telling them stories of the cities and rivers and mountains that lay beyond Dry Creek, making geography a grand adventure. Her most recent project was to have the older students keep a dry season journal. She encouraged them to write down their observations of the world around them, the changing color of the prairie grass, the depth of the creek, the number of new calves born on their family's land. It was a way to connect the act of writing to their own lives, to show them that their world, in all its dusty reality, was worthy of being recorded. It was also an idea that subtly challenged the town's stoicism, suggesting that their daily struggles and small triumphs were not just to be endured, but to be documented and understood. One warm afternoon, the lesson on fractions was interrupted by a low, mournful sound from the schoolyard. A large Hereford cow, having found a weak spot in the Porter Ranch fence, had wandered onto the grounds and was now contentedly chewing its cud in the shade of the schoolhouse wall. The children erupted in giggles. Daniel Pike immediately raised his hand. "Miss Bell, can we use the cow to learn Division I cow divided by 20 students?" Before Abigail could formulate a response, a rider appeared at the edge of the schoolyard. It was Luke Callahan. He swung down from his horse, his movements economical and sure. He did not seem surprised to find the stray. He simply took a rope from his saddle and approached the animal with a quiet confidence that the cow seemed to understand. He tipped his hat as he approached the schoolhouse steps, where Abigail now stood, her arms crossed. The cow, now secured, ambled placidly behind him. "Afternoon. Schoolteacher," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching with amusement. "Taught any cows to spell yet?" The children, who had crowded near the door to watch, let out another wave of laughter. Abigail raised an eyebrow, refusing to be flustered. "We were just getting to it," she replied coolly. "It starts with an M. For moo." Luke's quiet laugh was a low, pleasant rumble. "I'll be sure to let the foreman know. He'll be pleased she's getting a proper education." He nodded to her again, his gray eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then led the errant student away. The lightness of that moment did not last. The following week, as Abigail was explaining the workings of a printing press, a subject dear to her heart, the schoolhouse door opened to admit Ephraim Pike and Pastor Griggs. They stood at the back of the room, their dark suits and stern expressions casting a pall over the sunny classroom. Abigail's lesson was drawn from a recent copy of a newspaper sent from back east. She was using an article about a miners' strike in Pennsylvania to illustrate how newspapers could give a voice to working men. She saw the two men exchange a dark look. She finished her lesson and dismissed the children for their midday break. As the students filed out, Pike and Griggs approached her desk. "Miss Bell," Pike began, picking up the newspaper as if it were contaminated. "What is the meaning of this?" "It is a lesson, Mr. Pike," Abigail said, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, "on current events and the importance of the press." "It is sedition," Pastor Griggs declared, his voice a low boom. "You are filling these children's heads with dangerous, foreign ideas about labor and unions. Their duty is to God, their families, and their community, not to some rabble-rousing miners 1,000 miles away." "I believe it is my duty to teach them how to think, Pastor," Abigail countered, her voice even, not what to think. "Their thinking should be guided by Scripture and established authority," Pike said sharply. "We will not have these children's minds poisoned with agitation and discontent. Stick to arithmetic and penmanship. Miss Bell, you are not to bring such materials into this classroom again. Is that understood?" The unspoken threat hung in the air between them. "Conform, or you will be removed." Abigail gave a stiff, slight nod, unable to trust her voice. They turned and left, leaving her standing in the sudden silence of the empty room. That night, she could not sleep. The fear of dismissal was a cold knot in her stomach. It was more than just the loss of a job. It was the failure of her entire purpose for coming west. She thought of her father, a quiet man with ink-stained fingers and a passionate belief in fairness. He had run a small printing press, often publishing pamphlets and flyers for local labor movements, arguing for better wages and safer working conditions. He had been called a radical, an agitator, the same words Pike and Griggs had used. He had not died in a protest or a riot, but quietly in his bed from a fever that swept through their town one wet summer. But in her mind, his death was a martyrdom to his convictions. To back down now would feel like a betrayal of his memory. She would not do it. She could not. The next morning, as she walked up the schoolhouse steps, she noticed something was different. The third step, which had always had a slight wobble, was now firm and solid beneath her foot. Curious. She knelt down. A new, expertly fitted wedge of wood had been hammered into place, securing the loose board, and tucked into the dark space beneath the step was a small object. She reached in and drew it out. It was a simple whittling knife, its wooden handle worn smooth with use. Carved into the wood with clean, precise strokes were two letters A, B. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew, with absolute certainty, who had left it. It was not a gift to be shown off or even acknowledged. It was a quiet, secret act of support, a silent message that she was not entirely alone. It was an object of protection, a tool meant for creating, not for harming. She closed her fingers around the smooth handle and felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. She saw him that evening. He was sitting on the top rail of the porter corral, mending a bridle as the sun went down. She had walked out that way on purpose, the small knife tucked safely in her pocket. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Mr. Callahan." He looked up, his hands stilling. "Miss Bell." "The step is fixed," she said softly. He did not pretend to misunderstand. He simply nodded, his eyes on the horizon. It was loose. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the nicker of the horses and the evening song of the crickets. "My mother was a schoolmarm," he said suddenly, his voice low. "Back in Texas." taught in a room not much bigger than yours. He looked at his hands, at the calloused fingers holding the leather straps. She believed a book could do more good than a gun. Said reading gave a man a way to see over the next hill without having to climb it. He paused. That is why I respect the chalkboard more than the saloon table. It was the most he had ever said to her, a small, precious glimpse into the heart of the quiet man. It explained the respect in his eyes, the gentle courtesy that seemed so at odds with the rough world he inhabited. She sounds like a wise woman, Abigail said. She was, he said, and then the curtain of his usual reserve fell back into place. He returned to his work, and Abigail knew the conversation was over. She walked back to town as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The weight of Pike's and Griggs's disapproval still rested on her shoulders, but it felt lighter now. She was not just fighting for her father's memory anymore. She was fighting for Maya, and for Daniel, and for the quiet cowboy who understood the value of a well-taught lesson. The next day, she stood before her class, the small knife a secret warmth in her pocket. She looked at their faces, a collection of bright, curious, and hopeful eyes. "I want to make a promise to all of you," she said, her voice ringing with a new and unshakable conviction. "As long as I'm your teacher, every single one of you has a place at these desks. No matter who you are or where you come from, this room will be a place where your questions are welcome and your voices will be heard." It was a small oath, spoken in a simple room in a dusty corner of Montana. But Abigail Bell knew it was the most important promise she had ever made, and that she would have to pay a price for it. The first shot was not fired from a gun. It was fired from a bottle of cheap whiskey in the smoky confines of the Silver Spur Saloon on a Saturday night. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed men and the sharp tang of spirits, a haze of blue smoke hanging under the low, timbered ceiling. Ephraim Pike sat at a corner table, not drinking himself, but buying rounds for a select group of ranchers and townsmen whose opinions were as parched for reinforcement as the land was for rain. He let the whiskey do its work, loosening tongues and dulling the sharp edges of reason. Then, in a casual, concerned tone, he began to plant the seeds. "A fine woman, our new schoolteacher," he began, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Dedicated, but perhaps a bit naive about the ways of the frontier. A man named Hank Doolin, whose face was a roadmap of busted veins, grunted in agreement. She's from back east. They're all soft." "It's not her softness that concerns me," Pike said, leaning in conspiratorially. "It's her judgment. I saw it myself, right in front of the school, the day that wagon broke loose." He paused, letting the men's attention focus on him. She was quite familiar with that cowboy. Callahan, an open display, right there in the street for all the children to see. He let the insinuation hang in the air. Familiar, open display. Vague words, but potent, in the minds of men conditioned by the strict, unwritten codes of the West. They painted a vivid, scandalous picture. The next day, after the Sunday sermon in which Pastor Griggs spoke at length on the virtues of public modesty and the snares of temptation, Pike put the second part of his plan into motion. He found his son, Daniel, in the small yard behind their house, practicing his letters on a slate. "Daniel," Ephraim said, his voice unnaturally gentle, "you have a talent for drawing. I have seen your sketches of horses and such. They are quite lifelike." The boy looked up, surprised and pleased by the rare praise. "Thank you, Father. I have a task for you, a test of your memory and your skill." Pike sat down beside him. "I want you to draw for me the scene at the schoolhouse, the day of the runaway wagon. I need to document it for the town records." He placed a clean sheet of paper and a stick of charcoal in front of the boy. "Draw it exactly as you remember it. The schoolteacher, Miss Bell, and the cowboy, Mr. Callahan." Daniel's brow furrowed in confusion, but he did as he was told. He was a boy who noticed details. He drew the rearing horses, the skewed wagon, and the small figure of Maya on the ground. Then he drew Abigail and Luke. He sketched Abigail kneeling, her hand outstretched toward the fallen girl, and Luke standing nearby, his hand having just released the bridle of the lead horse. In the sketch, their hands were close, almost touching, a moment of shared crisis and relief. It was an innocent, accurate depiction of the event. Pike took the drawing and studied it, a slow smile spreading across his face. Excellent. Son, you have a keen eye. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his coat pocket. The image was perfect, with a few well-chosen words. The proximity of those two hands could be twisted from a gesture of aid into an act of illicit intimacy, an embrace, a public spectacle. He had his evidence. On Monday afternoon, a notice was posted on the church door. An emergency meeting of the Dry Creek School Board was called for that evening to discuss a matter of grave importance regarding the conduct of the schoolteacher. The meeting was held in the church itself, the pews filled with the town's most influential citizens. Pike, Pastor Griggs, and two other ranchers sat at a table before the altar, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Abigail stood before them, alone. She had worn her plainest, most severe dress, her hair pulled back so tightly it hurt her scalp. She would not give them any ammunition. Pike began the proceedings, his voice dripping with false regret. He spoke of the sacred trust placed in a teacher, of her role as a moral compass for the community's children. Then, he produced Daniel's drawing, holding it up for all to see. This sketch, drawn by an innocent child, depicts what some have called a shocking lack of propriety. Pike announced, an open embrace between our schoolteacher and a hired cowboy, a man of questionable reputation, in plain view of the students. A low murmur rippled through the pews. Abigail felt a hot flush of anger and humiliation. That is a complete misrepresentation, she said, her voice shaking slightly despite her efforts to control it. Mr. Callahan had just saved a child's life. I was expressing my gratitude. Your own son was there. Ask him. My son drew what he saw, Pike said smoothly, ignoring the last part of her statement. Then I will offer other evidence, Abigail said, her courage returning. She stepped forward and placed her gradebook and a small stack of letters on the table. Here is my record of student progress. Every child, including those you would have me turn away, is learning. And here are letters, written in English and in Spanish, from parents thanking me for the kindness and attention I have shown their children. Pastor Griggs pushed the papers aside without looking at them. Miss Bell, you misunderstand the nature of this inquiry. A teacher's moral character is of greater import than her professional skill. We cannot have a woman of loose affections shaping the minds of our youth. The accusation was so bald, so unjust, that it stole her breath. She stood there, speechless, the weight of their sanctimonious judgment pressing down on her. The church doors opened at the back of the room. Luke Callahan stood there, his hat in his hands. He had clearly heard the pastor's words, and a cold fire burned in his gray eyes. He took a step forward. This is a lie, he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. I will not stand here and listen to you slander a good woman. If you have questions about what happened, ask me. Pike smirked. We have no need for the testimony of a common brawler. Luke started down the aisle, his jaw set, but Abigail held up a hand, stopping him. Her pride, her entire sense of self, was on the line. She had built her life on the power of reason and the strength of the written word. To be rescued now by this man of quiet action would feel like a concession that her own principles were worthless. No, Luke, she said, her voice clear and firm. Thank you, but this is my battle. She looked him directly in the eye. I live by words. Let me stand on them. He hesitated, his gaze searching hers, a silent argument passing between them. He saw the fierce independence in her eyes, the desperate need to fight this on her own terms. With a slow, reluctant nod, he stepped back into the shadows by the door. It was then that the wind began to rise, a low moan at first. It quickly grew into a high-pitched shriek. The air outside the church windows turned a sickly, yellowish brown. Dust and sand began to pelt the glass panes like a shower of fine gravel. A dust storm, sudden and violent, was descending upon them. The lamps flickered wildly. The entire church seemed to groan under the assault of the wind. A window pane on the far side of the sanctuary shattered, and a blast of grit and wind tore through the room, extinguishing half the lamps and sending people ducking for cover. Panic erupted, but Abigail's voice cut through the noise. "The children," she cried, remembering that several of her students had come to the meeting with their parents. "Get them under the pews now." Her teacher's instinct took over. The hearing was forgotten. She moved through the terrified crowd, gathering the children, her calm voice a steady anchor in the chaos. She helped them crawl under the heavy oak pews, shielding their faces from the stinging dust. As she worked, she saw Luke Callahan and a few of the other cowboys spring into action. They were not panicking. This was their world, a world where nature was a constant and often brutal adversary. Luke grabbed a heavy hymnboard and used it to barricade the broken window. Another man was testing the main door, making sure the crossbar was secure. They moved with a practical, unthinking competence, their focus entirely on securing the shelter. The lines of class and reputation dissolved in the face of their shared peril. Ephraim Pike and Pastor Griggs were just as helpless, just as covered in dust, as everyone else. The storm raged for nearly an hour. When it finally passed, an eerie silence fell over the town. The world outside the church was cloaked in a thick, red haze. The schoolhouse, thanks to Luke's quick thinking and sturdy construction, had survived with no more than a few loose shingles. But many of the smaller, less protected homes on the edge of town, including the small shacks where Maya's family and other immigrant workers lived, had been badly damaged. Without a word, Abigail led the children from those families not back to their ruined homes, but to the one place she knew was safe and warm, the schoolhouse. She built up the fire in the stove, shared the contents of her own lunch pail, and made them comfortable on the floor with blankets borrowed from the church. It was an act of simple, human decency. The next morning, Pike found her there, sweeping dust from the floorboards while the children slept. He did not look chastened by the shared experience of the storm. He looked triumphant. "Miss Bell," he said, a cold satisfaction in his voice, "you have violated yet another regulation. The schoolhouse is not a public shelter. By allowing these outsiders to stay the night, you have compromised the building's purpose and created an unsanitary environment." Abigail stared at him, dumbfounded. He had taken her act of kindness and twisted it into another crime. The school board convened again that afternoon. The verdict was swift. Abigail Bell was suspended from her teaching duties for 1 week, pending a full investigation into her moral fitness and professional conduct. She walked back to Alma Quinn's boarding house in a daze, the official letter of suspension clutched in her hand. Her mind reeled. Does kindness itself now require a seal of approval, she wondered, a bitter taste in her mouth. Alma found her sitting on the porch, staring blankly at the dust-shrouded street. The older woman read the letter over her shoulder, then let out a sharp, derisive snort. "Don't you pay it any mind, girl," Alma said, settling into the rocking chair beside her. "Gossip is like pottery. Give it to a fool, and they'll always find a way to make it crooked. Pike's been wanting you out since you stood up to him. This is just his excuse." Abigail felt a tear trace a clean path through the dust on her cheek. "But what do I do?" "Alma, they have all the power." That evening, as dusk settled, Luke Callahan appeared at the end of the porch steps. He stood there for a long moment, his hat in his hands, his face grim in the fading light. "I should have spoken," he said, his voice rough with self-reproach. "I should not have let you stop me." Abigail shook her head, wiping her eyes. "It would not have mattered. They would have twisted your words, too." He walked up the steps and stood before her, his presence solid and comforting in the twilight. The air was still and heavy. It felt as though the whole world was holding its breath. Let me be your shield. Abigail, he said, his voice a low, earnest plea, let me stand between you and them. She looked up at his face, at the raw sincerity in his gray eyes. He was offering her his strength, his protection, everything he had, and she loved him for it, but she knew that hiding behind him was not the answer. It was not who she was, and it was not what she needed. No. Luke, she said softly, reaching out and placing her hand on his arm. His muscles were tense beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. Don't be a shield. She took a breath, finding the words for the truth that was forming in her heart. A truth forged in the fire of the last few days. Stand beside me. Suspension was a word that implied stillness, a state of waiting. But Abigail Bell had no intention of being still. On the first morning of her suspension, she rose before the sun, not with a sense of defeat, but with a quiet, burning resolve. She took 2 of Alma Quinn's kitchen chairs and her own small writing desk and carried them out to the patch of green lawn behind the boarding house. She hammered a spare bedsheet between 2 clothesline posts to create a makeshift sunshade. She brought out her slates, her precious few books, and a bucket of water with a dipper. When the school bell failed to ring at its appointed hour, a different kind of call went out across Dry Creek, a silent one carried by hope and defiance. And they came. First it was Maya and her 2 older brothers, their faces scrubbed clean, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and loyalty. Then came the children of a few hired ranch hands, boys and girls who arrived on foot, their dusty boots silent in the grass. By the time the sun had cleared the rooftops, nearly a third of her students were gathered on the lawn, sitting on the ground and looking at her with expectant eyes. A moment later, a wagon from the Porter Ranch rumbled to a stop in the alley. The driver, a stout man with kind eyes, unloaded a heavy can of fresh, still warm milk. Mrs. Porter's compliments, he said with a wink. Says young minds need fuel. Abigail's heart swelled with a gratitude so sharp it felt like pain. She was learning that support in this hard land often came not in words, but in practical gestures, a solid step, a can of milk, a silent presence. It was a new lesson for her, this art of accepting help without feeling diminished. She could receive the gift of milk and the lumber Luke quietly delivered later that day to improve her sunshade, but the lesson plans, the words she would use to shape the day, those remained fiercely her own. Her outdoor school had just begun its first lesson on the life cycle of the cottonwood tree when Pastor Griggs appeared. He stood at the edge of the lawn, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a thundercloud of disapproval. "Miss Bell," he called out, his voice echoing in the quiet morning air. "What is the meaning of this unauthorized assembly?" Abigail walked to meet him, leaving the children to study a leaf she had passed around. "It is a classroom. Pastor, the building may be closed to me, but the minds of these children are not." "This is an act of open defiance," he declared. "It is an affront to the lawful governance of this community school board. You are undermining our authority." "A community is not a board or a building, Pastor Griggs," Abigail replied, her voice low but unwavering. "It is the people. It is the belief that we are responsible for one another. These children have a right to their education." She gestured to the small, earnest group on the grass. "Community is born from letters, not from official seals. Letters build bridges. Seals can build walls." He stared at her, his jaw tight with indignation, but for once he seemed at a loss for a scriptural rebuttal. He turned on his heel and strode away, his stiff back a promise of future retribution. The afternoon brought a lighter presence. Luke Callahan rode up, not on his usual workhorse, but leading a gentle mare. He did not dismount, but sat easily in his saddle at the edge of their makeshift classroom. The children watched him, their attention completely diverted. "Miss Bell tells me you're learning your letters," he said to the group, his voice a quiet rumble. The children nodded shyly. "Well, I don't know much from books, but I know cattle." With a piece of chalk he'd borrowed, he began to draw large, blocky letters on the smooth, worn leather of his saddle. He drew a B. "This is for Brutus," he said, "meanest longhorn bull in the territory. You see him, you run." He drew a C for Comet, fastest cutting horse I ever saw. He continued through the alphabet, linking each letter to a story, a name, a piece of the world these children understood intimately. They were captivated. The yard filled with their laughter as he described a horse named Noodle who was afraid of chickens. For a brief, sunlit hour, the lawn behind Alma's house was the finest school in all of Montana. But the shadows were gathering. That evening, Abigail saw young Daniel Pike scurrying out of his father's general store, his face pale and distressed. He was trying not to be seen, but she intercepted him near the town well. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he was clutching a piece of paper. "Daniel, is everything all right?" she asked gently. He flinched, trying to hide the paper. "It's nothing." "Miss Bell." "You can tell me," she said, her voice soft. With a trembling hand, he showed her the paper. On it, in his own neat cursive, was the beginning of a statement, a full and honest confession. It was titled, it began, "I saw Miss Bell and the cowboy in an unseemly manner." He had not written any more. "My father," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. "He said I remembered it wrong. He said I had to write it down the right way. For the good of the town, he said if I did not, he would be very disappointed in me." Abigail's blood ran cold. The man was using his own son, poisoning his conscience to serve his own bitter agenda. She knelt down, putting her hands on the boy's shoulders. She looked past his fear and saw the fundamental decency he was struggling to hold on to. She would not let Pike extinguish it. "Daniel, listen to me," she said firmly. "You are a good and honest boy. You will not write a lie. Not for your father, not for anyone." She took the paper from him. "This is not your burden to carry." She did not tear it up in a grand gesture. She simply folded it and tucked it away. She would not use it against the boy, or even against his father. Her battle was not with this frightened child. "Go home, Daniel. Be brave. The truth has a way of finding its own voice." He looked at her, his eyes wide with a desperate, grateful relief. And then he ran. The pressure on Luke was more direct. In the saloon 2 nights later, Hank Doolin, his courage fortified by Pike's whiskey, cornered him at the bar. "Well, well," Doolin slurred, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "If it is not the schoolteacher's protector, Callahan, the famous gunslinger." He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Luke's boots. "Tell me, Callahan, does she know she is being protected by a man with blood on his hands?" The room went quiet. Every eye turned to Luke. He did not move, did not even look at Doolin. He kept his gaze fixed on his own reflection in the murky mirror behind the bar. "You think we forgot," Doolin sneered, emboldened by the lack of response. "You think we forgot how you shot Tom Calloway down in cold blood." Luke finally turned his head, his gray eyes as cold and flat as river stones. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with a quiet, chilling precision that cut through the drunken haze. Tom Calloway was a grown man who made his own choices. He chose to threaten a woman and her children. I made a choice, too. He paused, and his gaze swept over the silent men in the room. I used my gun that day so I could live, and so that another schoolteacher, and her students, could do the same. He turned back to the bar, picked up his drink, and finished it in one swallow. He placed the empty glass down, put a coin on the counter, and walked out, leaving a room full of men in stunned, uneasy silence. Throughout the week of her suspension, Abigail carried the small whittling knife Luke had left her. It stayed in the pocket of her dress, a secret, tangible reminder of his quiet support. It had been a symbol of protection, but its meaning was changing for her now. One afternoon, when a young boy's slate pencil snapped, she took out the knife. The other children watched, wide-eyed, as she calmly and expertly sharpened the pencil to a fine, new point. It was not a weapon. It was a tool. It was for making points, not for making threats. The rumors in town grew uglier. fed by Pike and Griggs. Formal complaints, signed by Pike's business associates and the most conservative members of the church, were filed with the town council. A letter arrived from the Dry Creek Bank, politely informing her that until the matter of her employment was resolved, her salary would be withheld. The town was choosing sides. The battle lines were no longer invisible. On Saturday, a new notice appeared on the church door. It was official, embossed with the town seal. It announced that a final hearing to determine the employment of Miss Abigail Bell would be held the following Sunday. Not in the church, and not in a private office. It would be held in the public square, on a platform to be erected for the spring festival. Ephraim Pike wanted more than her dismissal. He wanted her public humiliation. He was going to make an example of her for the whole town to see. The Sunday of the hearing dawned heavy and still, the air thick with an unspoken tension that was more oppressive than the heat. The usual cheerful sounds of the Lord's Day were absent. No children laughed on their way to Sunday school. No neighbors called out friendly greetings. A strange, watchful quiet had settled over Dry Creek. Most of the shops along the main street were closed, but a few had their doors pointedly half open, a gesture of ambiguous solidarity. In the center of the town square, directly in front of the bank, a crude platform had been erected from wooden freight pallets and empty barrels. It was not a stage for celebration, but a scaffold for humiliation. The ever-present wind was up, kicking little devils of red dust into the air, making them dance and swirl around the legs of the townspeople who gathered in a wide, uneasy circle. They were divided, husbands standing with stony faces on one side of the square, while their wives gathered in tight, whispering knots on the other. Abigail walked toward the platform from Alma Quinn's boarding house, her head held high. She did not walk alone. Alma was on her right, her expression as grim and unyielding as a granite outcrop. On her left was Mrs. Porter, the ranch owner's wife, a woman whose quiet dignity was a force of nature in itself. And behind them, a silent procession of the families Abigail had welcomed into her outdoor school followed, their presence a quiet but powerful testimony. Luke Callahan was not with them. He stood apart, leaning against the wall of the blacksmith's shop. His arms crossed over his chest. His face was unreadable, but his eyes never left Abigail. Ephraim Pike stood on the platform, dressed in his Sunday best, a leather-bound Bible on the crate in front of him. Pastor Griggs stood beside him, his head bowed. When Abigail reached the platform, Pike gestured for her to stand before them, in the center, like a defendant in the dock. Pike cleared his throat, letting the silence stretch until it was taut and uncomfortable. "We are gathered here today," he began, his voice ringing with a false sonority. Not in anger, but in sorrow. "We are here to uphold the sacred standards of our community, to protect the moral fiber that binds us together as a decent, God-fearing people." He spoke for a long time, his speech a winding river of empty phrases about duty, propriety, and the impressionable nature of children. He painted a picture of a town besieged by lax morals, with the schoolhouse as its most vital fortress, and Abigail as a careless sentry who had left the gate unlocked. Then, Pastor Griggs stepped forward. He did not speak to the crowd, but to the heavens, his eyes closed in a display of public piety. He prayed for guidance, for the strength to make difficult but righteous decisions, and for the soul of a community threatened by worldly temptation. Every word was a stone cast at Abigail. When the prayer was finished, Pike produced his evidence. He held up Daniel's sketch, which he had since had framed. This drawing, by the hand of an innocent, shows a scene of shocking impropriety, a public embrace, a shameless display that has no place before the eyes of our children. He then called his star witness, Hank Doolin, who staggered forward from the direction of the saloon, his eyes bleary, prodded by Pike's leading questions. Doolin mumbled his confirmation that he had heard talk, that everyone knew Callahan was a rough character, and that where there was smoke, there was surely fire. His testimony was a pathetic, drunken farce, but Pike presented it as unimpeachable proof. Finally, Pike turned to Abigail. "Miss Bell, do you have anything to say in your defense before this board renders its judgment?" This was her moment. The entire town was watching, waiting. She could see her students in the crowd, their small faces filled with confusion and fear. She saw Daniel Pike standing beside his mother, his eyes fixed on the ground in shame. She took a deep breath, the dusty air filling her lungs. She did not look at Pike. She looked out at the faces of the townspeople, at the children she had sworn to teach. "I will not speak of drawings or of gossip," she began, her voice quiet but carrying with a surprising clarity. "I will speak only of the truth of what happened that morning." She paused, her gaze steady. A child was in danger. A man acted with extraordinary courage and saved her life. In the moments that followed, in relief and gratitude, I reached out my hand to that child and to the man who had rescued her. She let her words settle in the quiet square. "If you call that an act of impropriety, then your definition of the word is not my own. If you call the simple, honest expression of gratitude a crime, then I am indeed guilty. I accept the charge." A murmur went through the crowd. Her simple, direct statement had cut through all of Pike's pompous rhetoric. It was the truth, and everyone knew it. Before Pike could respond, a new voice spoke, low and steady, from the edge of the crowd. "Then you will have to write my name down on that charge as well." Luke Callahan pushed himself off the wall and began to walk toward the platform. He moved without haste, his spurs making a soft, rhythmic clinking in the dust. The crowd parted for him. He stopped at the foot of the platform and looked up, not at Pike, but at Abigail. The love and fierce protectiveness in his eyes were as clear and bright as the morning sun. "You talk about standards, Mr. Pike," Luke said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. "This woman's standard is kindness. Her standard is courage. Her standard is treating every child, no matter their name or station, with dignity." He took another step closer. "You accuse her of an improper display of affection." He shook his head slowly. "You do not know the first thing about it. If caring for a person like that is a crime in this town, then I am the worst offender here." He looked back at Abigail, and his voice softened, becoming a declaration meant for her, but heard by all. "I love this woman. I love her for her stubbornness, for her goodness, and for the brave, unwavering kindness in her heart." A collective gasp went through the square. It was a stunning, unheard-of confession in this place of unspoken rules and guarded emotions. Pike's face was a mask of fury. He had lost control. The public shaming had turned into a public spectacle of defiance and love. He grabbed a wooden mallet from the crate beside him, the kind used for sealing barrels. "This is an outrage. This hearing is concluded," he roared, his voice cracking. He raised the mallet high. "By the authority vested in me as chairman of the Dry Creek School Board, I hereby declare the employment of Miss Abigail Bell terminated. She is fired." He brought the mallet down on the wooden crate with a loud, final crack. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then, a smattering of applause broke out from the corner of the square where Pike's staunchest supporters stood. But the rest of the crowd was still stunned into inaction. Abigail felt the word fired like a physical blow. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and for a moment, the faces in the crowd blurred. This was it, the end. She had lost. She looked at her students and saw tears welling in Maya's eyes. The sight broke her heart, but it also solidified her resolve. She would not break. She would not let them see her cry. She stood taller, her back straight, her chin up. Then a new movement began. Alma Quinn, her face set like stone, walked out of the crowd and up to the platform. In her hands, she carried a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. She did not say a word. She simply bent down and placed the book firmly on the platform, a silent offering. She was followed by Mrs. Porter, who placed a heavy leather-bound volume of poetry beside Alma's book. Then came Maya's father, a humble, hard-working man. He walked to the platform and laid down a small, tattered Spanish Bible. One by one, others came forward, ranch hands, the blacksmith's wife, the families of the children she had taught on the lawn. They placed their own precious books on the platform, dog-eared novels, practical almanacs, children's primers. The crude stage of humiliation was being transformed, book by book, into an altar of silent protest. The sight seemed to enrage Pike even further, but before he could speak, a young, clear voice piped up from the crowd. It was one of Abigail's students, a freckle-faced boy named Sam. "Mr. Pike," he shouted, his voice carrying in the tense silence, "I am learning to read because of her if you fire her, who is going to teach you how to spell my family's cattle brand correctly on your next bill." A ripple of surprised laughter went through the crowd, starting as a few chuckles and growing into a wave of genuine amusement. The boy's innocent, practical defiance had broken the spell of fear and intimidation. It was a child's logic, but it was unassailable. It reminded everyone of what was truly at stake. Abigail looked at the pile of books, and then at Luke, who had now moved to stand at the bottom of the platform steps. A silent guardian. She had lost her job. She had lost the schoolhouse. But as she looked at the faces of the people who had stood with her, she realized she had not lost the things that truly mattered. She had not lost her purpose. The goal was no longer to keep her position. The goal was to keep education itself alive in Dry Creek. As the crowd began to murmur, a new thought, clear and sharp, formed in her mind, mirrored in the determined look she saw on Luke's face. If the town would not give them a school, then they would have to build one themselves. The West does not bargain. After the fire of public opinion came the trial by ice. An unseasonable cold snap descended from the north, a thief in the night that stole the lingering autumn warmth and replaced it with a brittle, killing frost. The prairie grass, already cured to a pale gold, became stiff and sharp as glass. The water in the town troughs froze solid, and the wind carried a bite that went straight to the bone. For the ranchers, it was a disaster. The cattle, still grazing in the high pastures, began to drift south, driven by a primal instinct to escape the cold. If they drifted too far, or piled up in a ravine, the Porter Ranch could lose half its herd. Survival became the town's only curriculum, while Luke Callahan and every able-bodied cowboy on the Porter payroll worked from dawn until long after dusk in a desperate, brutal cattle drive. Abigail Bell and Alma Quinn faced a different kind of crisis. With homes poorly insulated and firewood scarce, the children were the most vulnerable. The two women turned Alma's kitchen into a public commons. They kept a massive pot of soup simmering on the stove day and night, a rich, savory broth made from potatoes, carrots, and a side of beef donated by Mrs. Porter. They served it to any child who came to the back door, no questions asked, ladling warmth and life into cold, hungry bellies. In these raw, elemental days, the town's divisions seemed to melt away. Abigail saw Luke only in passing, a fleeting glimpse of a man encased in frost, his face chapped raw by the wind, his eyes weary but resolute as he drove a section of the herd across the shallow, ice-choked river. They were fighting the same battle on different fronts, protectors of the town's future, one tending to its livestock, the other to its children. When the cold snap finally broke, leaving behind a world scoured clean and weary, Abigail did not return to her outdoor classroom on the lawn. The porch itself became her new school. She called it the back porch reading room. Using the books that had been placed on the platform and a few of her own, she created a small, circulating library. There were no formal lessons, but a standing invitation. She sat in a rocking chair from mid-morning until late afternoon, and the children came. They would read aloud to her, practice their letters on slates she provided, or simply sit in the quiet company of books, turning pages with a reverence that touched her soul. She asked for no tuition. Instead, A small wooden crate on the porch steps began to fill with the currency of a community's gratitude. A half-dozen eggs would appear one morning, a sack of dried corn the next. A ranch hand with 3 sons who were learning to write their names left a neatly stacked cord of firewood, enough to last a week. It was a school built on barter and goodwill, a defiant little flicker of light against the encroaching darkness of Ephraim Pike's authority. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Luke came to her with his long-term plan. He had been watching her, seeing the limitations of the porch, the way a sudden rain shower could scatter her students. He sat on the porch steps, turning his hat over and over in his hands. "This is good, Abigail," he said, his voice low. "But it is not enough. It is not a real school." "It is what we have, Luke," she said softly. "We could have more," he countered, looking up, his gray eyes intense. "There is a piece of land, that vacant lot next to the blacksmith's shop. It is flat. The ground is good. No one has used it in years. We could build a schoolhouse there, a proper one. I can get the lumber from the ranch sawmill. Other men will help." Abigail's heart gave a hopeful leap, but it was immediately followed by a cold wave of fear. A fear not for herself, but for him. He had already sacrificed his reputation for her. This was something more. This was a direct, physical challenge to Pike and the establishment. "Luke, I cannot ask you to do that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You have already been dragged into so much trouble because of me. This would be an open declaration of war. They would come after you." He looked away, his gaze settling on the distant mountains. "Abigail," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Struggle is the native language of this country. If you wait for the trail to be smooth, you will die of old age at the trailhead. We build things here because they need building, not because it is easy." He looked back at her. "The question is, will you let me?" Before she could answer, their fragile hope was met with the cold, hard fist of the law. A registered letter arrived from the Dry Creek Bank the next day. It was a formal notice, filled with legal terms. It stated that the vacant lot in question was, in fact, part of a larger parcel of land held as collateral on a loan. The loan holder was Ephraim Pike. The letter concluded with a chillingly clear warning any unauthorized construction on said property would be considered trespassing, and the structure would be summarily dismantled at the builder's expense. That night, Luke did not come to the porch. Abigail found him long after dark, standing alone by the river, skipping flat stones across the black, glassy water. The moon was a sliver in the sky, offering little light. He did not seem to be aware of her approach until she was standing beside him. The silence between them was heavy. She knew this was about more than just a piece of land. Pike's legal maneuver had cornered him, pushing him toward a confrontation he had spent years trying to avoid. "I cannot do it again," he said suddenly, his voice rough. He was not speaking to her, but to the ghosts that haunted the riverbank. "I will not." She waited, knowing he needed to say the words. "The last time," he continued, his voice tight with a pain that was years old. "The last time I stood up for a schoolteacher, a man was badly hurt. Calloway, he was a brute, and he had it coming. He was harassing her, threatening her in her own home." Luke's hand clenched into a fist at his side. "I did not go there looking for a fight. I went to talk him down, but he pulled a knife. It happened so fast. I just reacted." He finally looked at her, and in the faint moonlight, she could see the profound torment in his eyes. "I never meant to shoot him, only to stop him, but he staggered, and the bullet went high. He lived, but he was never the same." He shook his head, a gesture of deep self-loathing. "The town called it self-defense, but I know what it felt like. It felt like I had let a monster out of its cage. I swore that day I would never again let my hands bring that kind of violence into the world to protect a woman. And now Pike, he is pushing me right back to that same place." Abigail's heart ached for him. She finally understood the true depth of his quietness, the immense self-control he exercised every single day. He was not afraid of other men, he was afraid of himself. She stepped closer and placed her hand on his arm. It was as hard as stone. "Luke," she said, her voice clear and steady in the darkness. "Look at me." He slowly raised his eyes to hers. "I do not need you to fire a gun for me. I do not need you to be a shield or a fist. I have seen what your hands can do. They can gentle a frightened horse. They can fix a broken step. They can build." She squeezed his arm. "I need you to sign your name, next to mine, as a partner, as the co-founder of our school. We will fight them with the law, with our names on a piece of paper, not with violence." He stared at her, a dawning realization in his eyes. She was not asking him to repeat his past. She was offering him a different future, a different way to be strong. The tension in his body seemed to ease, the fist at his side slowly unclenching. "A partnership," he said, the word tasting new and strange. "A partnership," she confirmed. "We stand together, or we fall together." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a promise, an oath taken in the moonlight by the river. The next day, they went to the vacant lot. It was a windswept, forgotten piece of ground, littered with weeds and old barrels. To the world, it was worthless. To them, it was a canvas. In defiance of the bank's letter, in defiance of the biting wind, they began to measure out the dimensions of their schoolhouse. Luke hammered 4 stout wooden stakes into the hard, cold ground, one at each corner, marking the foundation of their dream. They stood back and looked at the simple, 4-cornered outline, a small act of hope against the vast, indifferent prairie. Their defiance did not go unnoticed. The community, emboldened by their stand, rallied in its own small ways. One of the younger boys from Abigail's porch school arrived solemnly, carrying a noisy, strutting rooster. "He is for the school." "Miss Bell," the boy announced proudly. "He crows real loud every morning, right when the sun comes up. He can be our school bell." Abigail looked at the proud, preening bird, then at the boy's earnest face, and she laughed. A genuine, heartfelt laugh. "He is a wonderful contribution," she said. "He is hereby awarded a full scholarship." She winked at the boy. "We will call him Recess." The moment of lightness was short-lived. The following morning, when Luke went to the lot to begin clearing the ground, he found their work undone. The 4 corner stakes had been shattered, broken in half by a heavy, blunt instrument, and on the splintered top of the stake nearest the road, a crude mark had been carved with a knife. It looked like the letters E.P., but the cuts were clumsy, intentionally rough. It could have been Pike's initials, or it could have been a forgery, designed to look that way. It did not matter. The message was clear. A hand was moving in the darkness, a hand that would not stop with legal threats. The first act of physical aggression had been made. The stakes had been broken, and the war for Dry Creek's future had truly begun. The broken stakes were a wound in the earth, a violation that left a cold knot of dread in Abigail's stomach. But there was no time to dwell on the malice of men, for a greater, more impartial menace was gathering in the north. The sky, which for days had been a hard, brilliant blue, began to bleed into a pale, milky gray. The wind, once a dry whisper, took on a deeper, more mournful voice, and the air grew heavy with a strange, oppressive stillness. The old-timers in town sniffed the wind, squinted at the sky, and began to secure their shutters and bring their livestock into their barns. An early snow was coming. It came not as a gentle dusting, but as a furious, horizontal assault. The world dissolved into a blinding chaos of white. The snow did not fall. It flew, driven by a wind that screamed like a banshee, piling into massive drifts that changed the very geography of the town. Vision was reduced to a few feet. To be caught out in it was a death sentence. The back porch reading room was instantly obsolete, its flimsy sunshade torn away by the first great gust. Alma Quinn's house, sturdy and well-built, became an island in the roaring blizzard, and to that island came refugees. The first to arrive were the families from the edge of town, their small, poorly chinked cabins offering little protection against the storm's fury. They came huddled together, their faces raw with cold, their thin shawls crusted with ice. Abigail took charge immediately, her voice calm and clear amidst the rising panic. "Alma, we need blankets, every one you have, and put more water on to boil for tea." She turned to the shivering arrivals. "Come in, get by the fire. There is room for everyone." Luke Callahan arrived minutes later, not as a guest, but as a commander organizing a defense. He was a force of nature in his own right, his broad shoulders blocking the doorway as he kicked a drift of snow from the threshold. "The woodpile needs to be covered, or we will lose it," he announced, his voice cutting through the wind's howl. "And the horses in the stable need to be checked." The small house became a microcosm of a functioning community. Abigail was the coordinator, her mind a quick ledger of needs and resources. She assigned places by the fire, organized the distribution of blankets, and kept the children calm with a softly told story. Luke was the chief of engineering and supply, a silent, powerful presence who kept the fire in the great kitchen stove roaring with heat, its comforting glow a bastion against the raging white world outside. He secured loose shutters, insulated the windows with spare blankets, and exuded a quiet competence that was as warming as the fire itself. And Maya, the small, shy girl, found her voice. When an elderly Mexican couple arrived, their face etched with terror and confusion, unable to speak a word of English, Maya stepped forward. She became their bridge, translating their fears and needs to Abigail, and Abigail's reassurances back to them in the heart of the storm. The little girl who had been a silent observer became a vital link, her two languages a thread that wove the disparate group together. For hours, the storm was their entire world. Then, a new sound joined the wind's shriek, a loud, insistent pounding on the front door. Luke opened it to reveal a figure so bundled in a heavy buffalo coat and furs that he was almost unrecognizable. It was Ephraim Pike. He stomped into the room, shaking snow from his coat, his eyes taking in the scene with unconcealed disgust. The floor was crowded with people he considered beneath his station, huddled together in the warmth of his adversary's makeshift sanctuary. "What is the meaning of this?" Pike demanded, his voice muffled by his scarf. "This is an unauthorized public gathering. You are creating a health hazard. I order you to disperse these people to their own homes." The sheer absurdity of the command, in the midst of a life-threatening blizzard, left Abigail speechless. But Luke stepped forward, placing himself between Pike and the crowded room. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a single threatening move. He was simply an immovable object. "They are staying," Luke said, his voice flat and final. "You have no authority to make this house a public shelter," Pike sputtered, his face purpling with rage. "You do not have a permit." Luke looked at the frightened faces of the children by the fire, at the old woman Maya was comforting, at the weary, determined expression on Abigail's face. He turned his gaze back to Pike. "This is our permit," Luke said, his voice a low rumble. He tapped his own chest, directly over his heart. Conscience. Pike seemed to shrink before the simple, profound power of the word. He opened his mouth to argue, but no sound came out. He was a man of rules and regulations in a moment when only humanity mattered, and he had been found utterly wanting. He turned, defeated, and plunged back into the storm. Not long after, there was a quiet scratching at the back door. When Abigail opened it, she found young Daniel Pike standing there, shivering, a large bundle in his arms. It was a stack of thick wool blankets from his mother's linen chest. "Mother said, she said people must be cold," Daniel whispered, his eyes wide, avoiding her gaze. He pushed the bundle into her arms. Just then, the front door opened again, and Ephraim Pike stormed back in, having clearly seen his son cross the yard. "Daniel, what are you doing? I forbid this!" he roared, grabbing his son's arm. Daniel cried out, more from fear than pain, but before Pike could drag him away, Abigail stepped between them. She did not touch Pike, She simply stood in his path, shielding the boy. "He is doing a good and decent thing, Mr. Pike," she said, her voice filled with a cold, quiet anger. "Perhaps you should try it sometime." Pike stared at her, then at his son, whose face was a mixture of terror and a new flickering spark of defiance. For the first time, Pike's authority had been challenged not just by outsiders, but from within his own family. The crack that had been forming in their relationship had just widened into a chasm. He yanked his hand back from his son's arm as if he had been burned, gave Abigail a look of pure hatred, and retreated once more into the storm, leaving his son and his blankets behind. The long night wore on. The wind howled, and the house creaked and groaned like a ship in a heavy sea. The refugees, warmed by soup and a sense of shared safety, eventually fell into an exhausted sleep, their bodies curled together on the floor. Luke had been outside again, checking on the animals in Alma's small stable. When he came back in, he stood by the fire, trying to work his fingers, his face grim. Abigail saw that his heavy gloves were frozen stiff, and his hands, when he finally managed to pull the gloves off, were a deathly white, the skin waxy and unmoving. "Luke," she whispered, rushing to his side. "Your hands." He tried to flex them, but they would not obey. A tremor of pain shot through him. "I cannot feel them," he said, his voice tight. Without a second thought, she took his frozen hands in hers. They felt like blocks of ice. She began to chafe them gently, her own warmth a stark contrast to their deadly cold. She brought his hands to her mouth, her warm breath flowing over his numb fingers in a soft, white cloud. She could feel the sharp, painful tingle as life began to return to them, and she saw him flinch. He looked down at her head bent over his hands, at the focused, desperate care on her face. The stove fire cast a warm, flickering light on them, creating a small, intimate world in the heart of the sleeping house. He put his other, less frozen hand on her shoulder. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, with the storm raging outside and the sleeping town all around them, there were no words for what passed between them. It was a current of pure, undiluted truth. He slowly leaned down, and she leaned up, and they rested their foreheads together, a gesture of profound and weary intimacy. "I am here," she whispered against his skin. "So am I," he breathed back. The storm passed with the dawn, leaving behind a world of breathtaking, terrible beauty. Dry Creek was buried under a blanket of white, the sky a fragile, brilliant blue. The town began to dig itself out, and in the aftermath, a subtle shift occurred. When Alma Quinn began circulating a petition in support of a new, independent school, she found doors opening that had once been closed. People had not forgotten who kept the fire going and who had tried to cast them back into the storm. Even Pastor Griggs, who had seen half of his congregation taking refuge in Alma's house, was seen staring at the petition for a long, contemplative moment, his rigid certainty visibly shaken. A few days later, Luke was helping to clear the heavy snow from the roof of the old schoolhouse when he saw it. The great brass bell, loosened by the storm's violent winds, had fallen from its belfry. It was half buried in a massive snowdrift, its proud voice silenced. He spent the better part of the afternoon digging it out. That evening, he brought it to Alma's back porch on a sledge. It was tarnished and dented, but it was whole. He stood before Abigail in the cold, clear twilight. "It fell," he said simply. He reached out and touched the cold metal. "This bell will ring again. Abigail, I promise you, it will ring wherever you choose to stand." But Pike's defeat in the storm had only hardened his resolve. The following week, he filed a formal, legal complaint with the circuit judge. He accused Abigail Bell of being a public nuisance, of inciting unrest, and of operating an unsanctioned and dangerous public assembly. The final hearing was scheduled, not in a stuffy office, but in the town square, on the day of the annual spring festival. a time of celebration that Pike intended to turn into a final, public execution of her career and her dreams. The news left Abigail with a sickening choice. She could leave. She could pack her bags, take a stagecoach east, and leave Dry Creek and its bitterness behind her. She could preserve her name and her professional reputation. And she would be taking Luke out of the line of fire. If she was gone, Pike's crusade would be over. But if she stayed, she knew Pike would continue to push, to provoke, until he finally backed Luke into the violent corner he had so long dreaded. To stay was to risk the very soul of the man she had come to love. That night, as she wrestled with her decision, a new alarm was raised. A frantic shout from the direction of the town center. Fire! She and Luke ran out into the street. A terrifying orange glow was flickering against the night sky. The fire was not in the town itself, but on the edge of it. It was at the vacant lot. The stack of lumber Luke had painstakingly salvaged and gathered for their schoolhouse was ablaze. They joined the bucket brigade, working alongside the very same people who had signed Alma's petition. They fought the flames with a desperate fury, and by the time the fire was extinguished, half the lumber had been saved. But as the smoke cleared, the blacksmith, holding a lantern high, pointed to the muddy ground near the charred wood pile. There, preserved in the damp earth, were the deep, clear prints of a single pair of heavy boots. They were not the worn, familiar prints of a cowboy. The heel was oddly shaped, the sole unfamiliar. Someone had stood there, watched the fire catch, and then walked calmly away. The attack was no longer a matter of words or laws. The first shot had been fired in the night, and the smell of smoke and malice hung heavy in the cold, clear air. The day of the spring festival arrived not with the heavy sense of dread that had preceded it, but on a wave of bright, cheerful energy. The town square, the designated stage for Abigail's public trial, was transformed. Colorful canvas tents dotted the perimeter, sheltering tables laden with apple pies, jars of preserves, and intricate quilts. The lively, cheerful tune of a banjo danced in the air, weaving through the laughter of children chasing each other in wide, joyful circles. The air smelled of sugar, sawdust, and the rich, loamy scent of the newly thawed earth. It was a celebration of survival, of having made it through another harsh Montana winter. But in the center of it all, the raw lumber platform stood like a gallows in a flower garden. It was the festival's main stage, meant for speeches and pie-eating contests. But today, its purpose was grim. Ephraim Pike and Pastor Griggs were already seated upon it, their dark suits a stark, somber contrast to the festival's vibrant colors. Abigail and Luke walked into this strange, divided reality together. They did not hold hands, but the space between them was charged with a quiet, unshakable solidarity. The townspeople fell silent as they passed, the banjo music faltering for a moment. They were no longer just a schoolteacher and a cowboy. They were the heart of the day's central, unavoidable drama. Pike let them take their place before the platform, then rose to his feet. Holding a sheaf of papers, he began to speak, his voice cutting through the festive atmosphere, forcing the town to turn its attention from celebration to condemnation. He accused Abigail of moral and organizational failings, twisting every one of her actions into a crime. The back porch reading room was an unregulated and potentially dangerous gathering of unsupervised children. The shelter she provided during the blizzard was a reckless violation of public health standards. The fire that had destroyed their lumber was, he insinuated, a result of their own carelessness, further proof of their unfitness. When he finished, Abigail stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not trade accusations. She presented facts. She held up a simple, neatly kept ledger. "This is the record of the back porch reading room," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It lists every child who attended, every book they read, and the progress they made. It is a record of education, not of chaos." She then produced another list. "This is a list of the 27 people who took shelter at Mrs. Quinn's home during the blizzard. It includes names you all know. It includes the elderly and the very young. It is a record of a community caring for its own, not of a public nuisance. She placed the lists on the edge of the platform. The town doctor has provided a signed statement attesting to the health and well-being of every person who took shelter with us that night. Her defense was calm, rational, and built on the foundation of her actions. It was a stark contrast to Pike's empty, venomous rhetoric. A restless murmur began to move through the crowd. It was then that the second, decisive crack appeared in Pike's armor. A small figure detached himself from the crowd and walked toward the platform with a slow, trembling gait. It was Daniel Pike. His face was pale, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. He stopped before his father, unable to look at him, his eyes fixed on the wooden planks of the stage. "Father," he began, his voice a choked whisper. Then he took a deep, shuddering breath and spoke louder, his voice ringing with the terrible, liberating power of truth. "The drawing," he said, his voice cracking. "The drawing of Miss Bell and Mr. Callahan, it was not like you said. You told me to make their hands look closer. You said it was for the town record, but it was not the truth. It was a lie, and I am sorry." The boy began to sob, a heart-wrenching sound that silenced the entire square. His mother rushed forward and wrapped her arms around him, glaring at her husband with an expression of pure, unadulterated fury. The crowd erupted in a roar of shock and anger. Pastor Griggs rose to his feet, his face ashen. He looked from the weeping boy to the stunned face of Ephraim Pike, and a look of profound shame and regret dawned on his features. He stepped to the front of the platform. I have been a party to a great injustice," he said, his voice heavy with contrition. "I allowed my certainty to blind me to the truth. I judged this woman hastily and without charity. I ask for her forgiveness, and for the forgiveness of this community." The confession had broken Pike's moral authority completely. Now, his financial one was about to be exposed. A man from the back of the crowd, a surveyor who had been working for the railroad, pushed his way forward. "I think I know why Mr. Pike was so keen on that vacant lot. He called out, he hired me last month. He and the bank are planning to build a new freight warehouse there. It is the only plot of land with direct access to the new rail spur. He was never concerned about a school. He just wanted the land for himself." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The whole affair, from the manufactured rumors to the public hearing, had been nothing more than a greedy, cynical land grab disguised as a moral crusade. Pike stood exposed, his hypocrisy laid bare for the entire town to see. Abigail looked at the man, not with triumph, but with a kind of weary pity. She stepped forward, her voice calm and devoid of malice. It was the voice of a teacher, stating a fundamental principle. "Mr. Pike," she said, her words clear and precise, "your laws are built on greed and your rules are built on lies. If teaching children to read and to be kind to one another is a violation of your law, then I will choose the law of the children every time." It was a moral declaration of independence. Pike, his face contorted with rage and humiliation, seemed to snap. He gestured to two rough-looking men who had been standing near the platform, men who were on his payroll. "Get them out of here," he snarled. "This is my property." The two men started forward, their intentions clear, but they never reached Abigail. Luke Callahan moved to stand in front of her. He did not reach for the gun at his hip. He did not raise his fists. He simply stood there, his body a living wall, his expression one of absolute, unshakable calm. He was honoring his promise. He was protecting her without violence. As the two hired thugs hesitated, a remarkable thing happened. The crowd surged forward, not in anger, but in solidarity. They formed a spontaneous, living circle around Abigail and Luke, linking arms, creating a human barrier that Pike's men could not breach. The blacksmith stood next to a ranch hand, who stood next to Maya's father. It was the town, all of it, standing as one. The standoff was broken by the sharp, no-nonsense voice of Alma Quinn. She pushed her way to the front of the circle, a folded piece of paper held aloft in her hand like a banner. "You might want to see this before you make another move." "Ephraim," she called out, "it seems you are the one who is trespassing." She handed the paper to a well-dressed stranger who had been standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. He unfolded it and read it aloud, his voice the crisp, clear tone of a legal professional. It was an official deed of title. It stated that 3 days prior, Mrs. Porter had purchased the disputed vacant lot from the Dry Creek Bank for a generous sum. It further stated that on this very morning, she had legally gifted the property, free and clear of all liens, to be held in joint ownership by Miss Abigail Bell and Mr. Luke Callahan, for the express purpose of building a community school. The traveling circuit lawyer then held up the document for all to see, the official notary seal clearly visible. It was a masterstroke, a perfectly executed legal maneuver that had cut the ground out from under Pike's feet. He had lost his moral authority, and now he had lost his land. He had lost everything. A great, ragged cheer went up from the crowd, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy and relief. The banjo player, taking his cue, struck up a lively, triumphant tune. Pastor Griggs, his face shining with a convert's zeal, held up his hands for quiet. "I believe the verdict of this community is clear," he announced, his voice booming with a newfound conviction. "But let us make it official, all those in favor of supporting this new school, and of formally and forever rescinding the unjust dismissal of Miss Bell. Please raise your hands." A forest of hands shot into the air. It was nearly unanimous. The community had rendered its judgment. Ephraim Pike stood alone on the platform, a man on a desolate island, the festive sounds of the town washing over him like a tide of defeat. He said nothing. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, his influence shattered, his public life in Dry Creek over. A bitter resentment lingered in his eyes, a promise that the story was not quite finished. But his power was gone. The heart of the town had proven stronger than his greed. The roar of the crowd was a physical thing, a wave of sound and relief that washed over Abigail, sweeping away the last vestiges of fear. The people of Dry Creek, who had been a silent, watchful audience, were now a living, breathing part of the victory. They pressed in, not in a threatening way, but in a gesture of communal embrace. Hands reached out to pat Luke on the shoulder, and women's eyes, shining with tears, were fixed on Abigail with a newfound respect and affection. The banjo player, sensing the shift in the wind, struck up a joyful, rollicking tune that transformed the square from a courtroom into a festival once more. In the midst of this swirling, happy chaos, Luke turned to Abigail. The noise of the celebration, the laughter, the music, it all seemed to fade away, leaving them in a silent pocket of their own making. He looked at her not as a cause he had defended, but as the center of his world. His gray eyes, so often guarded and shadowed by the past, were clear and bright with an emotion so powerful it made her breath catch in her throat. All the unspoken words, all the quiet acts of support, all the shared fears and hopes coalesced in that one long look. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping gently around hers. Then, with a grace that was as natural to him as breathing, he went down on one knee on the rough wooden planks of the festival platform. The crowd, sensing the shift in the drama, grew quiet again, their joyous noise softening to a collective, indrawn breath. "Abigail," Luke began, his voice low and steady, meant only for her but heard by all in the sudden hush. "You came here to teach these children how to spell. You even tried to teach me a thing or two." A soft smile touched his lips. "You tried to teach me the word home." He shook his head slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "But every time I tried to spell it out in my head, it kept coming out as us." He held her hand a little tighter. "Will you marry me?" Abigail Bell. For a moment, the world stood still. Abigail's heart felt as if it would burst. All she could do was nod, tears of a different kind, tears of pure, unadulterated joy streaming down her face. "Yes," she whispered, the word a prayer. "Yes." A great cheer went up, even louder and more heartfelt than the one before. As Luke rose to his feet and pulled her into his arms, a booming, triumphant voice shouted out from the crowd. It was the blacksmith, his face split by a wide, happy grin. The schoolteacher was fired for loving a cowboy, he bellowed, his voice filled with a mixture of humor and immense pride. And now he is marrying her in front of the whole town. The crowd did not just cheer. They roared with laughter and delight, the perfect, improbable truth of the statement capturing the entire crazy saga in a single sentence. The applause was thunderous. Alma Quinn, her eyes twinkling, pushed her way through the well-wishers. "Well, you had best get on with it," she said in a loud stage whisper that carried across the square. "Marry her now before Ephraim Pike comes back and passes a law against it." The suggestion, meant as a joke, caught fire. A chorus of voices rose up, urging them on. "Do it now! Pastor Griggs is right here! Do not wait!" Pastor Griggs, his face still streaked with the tears of his repentance, stepped forward, his expression one of humble, profound purpose. "I have been wrong," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I helped tear something down in the name of a false piety. It would be the greatest honor of my life to help build something new in the name of love. If you will have me, I will marry you right here, right now." What followed was a beautiful, chaotic, and perfect expression of a community healing itself. Two cowboys, with a speed and efficiency born of years of roping cattle, scrambled to rig up the old, battered school bell, hanging it from the awning of the general store. The blacksmith disappeared into his workshop and emerged moments later, wiping soot from his hands. He held out two simple, unadorned rings of dark, polished iron, still warm from his forge. As Abigail and Luke stood before the pastor on the wooden platform, the townspeople of Dry Creek became their wedding party. The children, delighted by this new, unexpected turn in the festival, ran to the feed store and came back with their pockets full of dried corn kernels, which they began to shower over the couple like golden, hopeful confetti. Pastor Griggs opened his Bible, his hands trembling slightly. He spoke not of sin and judgment, but of forgiveness, partnership, and the quiet courage of a love that had been tested by fire, wind, and the malice of men. When he came to the final questions, his voice was strong and clear. "Luke Callahan, do you take this woman, Abigail Bell, to be your wife, to stand beside her, in hardship and in joy, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Luke said, his voice ringing with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "And Abigail Bell," the pastor said, turning to her, his eyes filled with a gentle kindness, "do you take this man, Luke Callahan, to be your husband, to stand beside him, in hardship and in joy, as long as you both shall live?" Abigail looked at Luke, at the quiet, steady man who had offered not to be her shield, but to be her partner. "I will," she said, her voice full of love and promise. At that moment, the old school bell rang out, its dented, tarnished voice no longer a summons to a contentious school board, but a joyous, clamoring celebration of a new beginning. Luke slid the simple iron band onto her finger. It was plain and strong, a perfect symbol of the man who gave it. She did the same for him. Then, in front of the whole town, he gently cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was not a long kiss, but it was real and true, a silent promise that sealed the spoken ones. As the crowd cheered and the banjo started up once more, they leaned their foreheads together, a moment of quiet intimacy in the center of the joyful storm. "We will start building the school tomorrow," she whispered, her voice full of plans and purpose. "Tonight," he whispered back, a smile in his voice. "Tonight, I will start framing the roof." The formal confrontation had dissolved completely, transformed into the town's most joyous celebration. The air, which had been thick with tension, was now filled with music and the happy shouts of children. A spontaneous square dance started in the center of the square, the fiddler joining the banjo player, their combined music a wild, exuberant invitation to life. As the celebration swirled around them, Abigail felt a small tug on her sleeve. She looked down to see Daniel Pike. He was holding a brand new, unopened notebook with a clean, unmarked cover. "For the new school, Miss Bell," he said, his voice quiet but clear. He held it out to her. "I was wondering, would you be the first one to sign your name in it? I am only going to write true things in it from now on." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes. She knelt down and pulled the boy into a hug, a gesture that was both a forgiveness and a promise. "Oh, Daniel," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "That is the most important lesson of all." She held him for a moment longer. "The truth can save people. It saved us all today." She stood up, taking Luke's hand. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip toward the mountains, casting long, golden shafts of light across the square. It illuminated the dancing couples, the laughing children, and the swirling clouds of red dust, transforming the symbol of their hardship into a glittering, celebratory haze. The high, hard plains of Montana were still an unforgiving place, but today, in this small, dusty town, the people had chosen to build something new on a foundation of love, truth, and community. The first frost of the new winter found a different dry creek. The season had turned, and a few months had passed since the festival that had remade the town's heart. On the once vacant lot next to the blacksmith's shop, where broken stakes had once marked a battlefield, a new building now stood. It was not large or grand, but it was sturdy, built of sweet-smelling pine planks that had been milled at the Porter Ranch and hammered into place by a dozen willing hands. Its tin roof, a gift from the freight company, pinged and ticked softly in the cold, a cheerful, metallic heartbeat. Inside, the single room was a haven of warmth and light. A new slate blackboard, purchased with the collection taken up by the ladies of the church, covered most of one wall. Shelves, built by Luke from the salvaged, fire-scarred lumber, lined the others. They were overflowing with books, a motley, beloved collection donated from every household in the valley. The room smelled of pine, chalk dust, and the constant, gentle aroma of coffee brewing on the pot-bellied stove. This was the Dry Creek Community School, built not by a board or a decree, but by the will of the people. Their daily life had found a new, deeper rhythm. Abigail's days were a joyful whirlwind of teaching. In the mornings and afternoons, the room was filled with the bright, chaotic energy of the children, their voices rising and falling as they recited their letters, read stories aloud, or worked through arithmetic problems. But her work did not end when the sun went down. 2 evenings a week, the schoolhouse filled again, this time with adults. Ranch hands whose hands were more accustomed to reins than pencils sat shoulder to shoulder with farmers' wives and young men from the town, all of them hungry for the knowledge that had been denied them. Abigail taught them to read contracts, to write letters to family back east, to understand the geography of the vast country they inhabited. Luke's life, too, had been reshaped. He still worked for the Porter Ranch, his skill with horses and cattle as sharp as ever, but his days no longer ended in the solitary silence of the bunkhouse. Every evening, he came to the school. He was its unofficial custodian and constant guardian, his quiet presence a source of comfort and stability. He would mend a broken bench, haul in more firewood, or sit in the back of the adult class, a book open in his lap, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was reading history, geography, even poetry, discovering the worlds his mother had told him about, seeing over the next hill without having to climb it. The change in them was profound. Abigail, the earnest schoolteacher from the East who had once been terrified of losing her position and her good name, now moved with the easy confidence of a woman who had built her own place in the world. She was no longer just a teacher. She was the heart of the town's intellectual and moral life, a leader whose authority came not from a board, but from the deep well of respect she had earned. Luke, the quiet cowboy who had been haunted by a single act of violence, had become a symbol of a different kind of strength. He had faced down his past and chosen a path of principled nonviolence. His quietness was no longer a shield for his pain, but a sign of his deep, unshakable resolve. He was a husband, a partner, and a man who had learned that true strength was in building things, not in breaking them. The old order had passed. Ephraim Pike had lost his seat on the town council in the next election. He was a quieter man now, confined to the world of his general store. He and Abigail exchanged polite, distant nods when they passed on the street, the war between them over, leaving only the quiet desolation of his defeat. His greatest legacy, and his greatest penance, was his own son. Daniel Pike was one of the most dedicated students in the evening class. He had discovered a passion for the written word, for the clean, honest mechanics of the printing press. He dreamed of becoming a printer himself, of spending his life arranging letters into words of truth, a quiet, lifelong atonement for the lie his father had forced him to write. The themes that had been the battleground of their lives had now become the peaceful foundation of their world. They had discovered that love was not a grand passion, but a quiet, daily act of standing beside someone. They had learned that a family was not just a matter of blood, but of choice and loyalty. They understood that justice was rarely found in a formal hearing, but in the collective conscience of a community that chooses kindness over prejudice. And they knew, with a certainty that was as real as the pine walls of their school, that education was the wellspring, the clean, common water that could wash the dust of ignorance and fear from a whole town. The most potent symbol of this new reality hung on a sturdy new frame on the front porch of the schoolhouse. It was the old brass bell, tarnished and dented from its fall, but its voice as clear as ever, every morning. Just as the sun broke over the jagged peaks of the mountains to the east, Luke would step out onto the porch and pull the thick rope, the bells clean. Hopeful peal would ring out over the waking town, and at its sound, Abigail would open the door of the schoolhouse, ready to welcome her students. The word he had struggled to spell, home, had found its true definition. It was not a place for just the two of them. It was a place whose door was opened for everyone. The wind still blew across the high plains, a constant, restless presence. It was still a hard wind, born of a hard country, but it no longer sounded like a lament. It did not carry the bitter sting of malice or the sharp grit of contention. It was just the wind, the breath of the vast, open land they had chosen as their own. It whistled around the corners of the schoolhouse, a wild harmony to the quiet hum of learning within. One evening, long after the last of the adult students had departed, they sat together on the porch of the small cabin Luke had built for them, a stone's throw from the school. The night was cold and clear, the sky a vault of brilliant, diamond-hard stars. They were not talking, but sharing a comfortable silence, reading by the light of a single lantern. Abigail was holding a piece of paper, a letter written in a slow, careful, and slightly clumsy hand. It was from Maya's father. He had written to tell her that for the first time in his life, he had been able to read a letter from his own brother in Mexico without having to ask someone else to read it to him. He wrote of the simple, profound dignity of that moment, of how the letters on the page had felt like a key unlocking a door in his own mind. Abigail finished reading and folded the letter carefully, her heart full. Luke reached over and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. They sat like that for a long time, watching the stars, their shoulders touching. "Are you tired?" he asked softly, his voice a low rumble in the quiet night. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the rough wool of his shirt familiar and comforting. "Yes," she said with a sigh, "but it is the right kind of tired." She squeezed his hand. It was the weariness that comes not from fighting a bitter, pointless battle, but from the deep, satisfying labor of building something that would last. The story of Dry Creek had become a quiet legend, a lesson whispered on the prairie wind. It was a story that proved that real justice is often a small, stubborn thing. A single teacher standing in a doorway, refusing to close it. It was a story that showed that the most profound and lasting love is not about dramatic rescues or grand declarations, but about the simple, unwavering choice to stand beside someone through the dust storm, through the blizzard, and through the long, hard winter of a town's soul. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please remember to subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like this video, and show your support by pressing the hype button so this story can reach even more listeners.